In August 1945, Japan wasn't just defeated, it was extinguished. 66 cities burned, 3 million dead. An empire that believed it was divine, reduced to a pile of ash. History tells us what happens next. When a proud nation is humiliated, it plots revenge. Germany did it after World War I. Russia stewed in resentment after the Cold War. The cycle of revanchism, the desire for blood, is almost a law of physics. But Japan? Japan broke the laws of physics. There were no suicide bombers targeting American bases in the 50s. There was no underground guerrilla army. Instead, within one generation, the sworn enemy became the best friend. Was it a miracle of forgiveness? No. It was something much colder and much smarter. This is the story of how Japan turned its conqueror into its bodyguard, its bank, and its customer. This is the story of the most successful survival strategy in human history. To understand the lack of revenge, you first have to understand the biological reality of 1946. You cannot fight a war when your caloric intake is below survival levels. The Japanese called this era Kyodatsu, total mental and physical collapse. The US Navy had cut off all oil, rubber, and food. The merchant marine was at the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese public had been trained to expect monsters. The wartime propaganda said the Americans would rape, pillage, and enslave. They expected the Mongol hordes. Instead, they got the Guerrilla program, government and relief in occupied areas. The United States became the sole lifeline for millions of starving people. When the devil is the only reason your children are eating tonight, the psychological impulse for revenge short circuits. Hatred was replaced by a confused, desperate gratitude. But bread alone doesn't buy loyalty. You need a god for that. General Douglas MacArthur understood something crucial. The Japanese fought for the emperor. If you kill the emperor, you create 1 million martyrs. If you keep the emperor, you control the soul of the nation. On September 27, 1945, the most important photograph in Japanese history was taken. MacArthur, towering, relaxed, hands on hips. Emperor Hirohito, small, stiff, dressed in a Western suit. The message was visual and brutal. The emperor is safe, but the emperor is small. MacArthur is the new shogun. When Hirohito accepted the surrender not as a defeat, but as a moral choice to endure the unendurable for world peace, he gave his people spiritual permission to stop fighting. To revolt against the Americans was now to revolt against the emperor's will. The conservative structure that started the war was used to end it. But who do you blame for the burning cities? You have to blame someone. The Americans and the Japanese elite collaborated on a massive PR campaign. They created a new narrative, the Dark Valley. The story went like this. The Japanese people were not aggressors. They were victims. They had been tricked and hijacked by a small, evil clique of militarists. This was the War Guilt Information Program. By executing the top generals and scrubbing the textbooks, they separated the people from the army. The Japanese citizen could say, "I don't need to take revenge on America because I was a victim of Tojo too." It was a psychological escape hatch, and the whole nation walked through it. By 1947, the vibe changed. The Cold War had begun. The communists took China. War was brewing in Korea. Suddenly, America didn't want a weak, pacifist Japan. They needed a fortress against communism. This is where the story gets dark. It's called the reverse course. The Americans stopped hunting war criminals and started hiring them. Look at Nobusuke Kishi. He was a Class A war criminal suspect, the economic czar of occupied Manchuria. He was supposed to be in prison. Instead, the CIA helped rehabilitate him. Why? Because he was a fierce anti-communist. He would eventually become prime minister. The very men who built the Japanese war machine were put back in power by the Americans. For these elites, the Americans weren't conquerors anymore. They were patrons. They protected Japan from the Soviet Union and the internal red threat of unions and socialists. The revenge wasn't directed at Washington. It was directed at Japanese communists. Then came the stroke of luck that saved the nation. June 1950. The Korean War begins. Japan became the forward supply base for the US military. Prime Minister Yoshida called it the gift of the gods. Toyota was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1949. By 1951, they were drowning in US military orders for trucks. Billions of dollars flooded into the Japanese economy. This was Tokuju, special procurement. This cemented the Yoshida Doctrine. The deal was simple. Japan would trade its military sovereignty for economic access. The US would handle security. Japan would handle making money. Why bite the hand that is signing the checks? Revenge is expensive. Being a supplier is profitable. But wait, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There was one moment where the anger almost boiled over. 1960, the renewal of the US-Japan Security Treaty, or UNPO. Hundreds of thousands of people surrounded the Diet Building. It was the largest protest in Japanese history. President Eisenhower had to cancel his visit because it wasn't safe. But look closer at what they were shouting. They weren't shouting revenge for Hiroshima. They were shouting, "Don't drag us into your nuclear war." It was fear of future entrapment, not revenge for the past. The protests failed, the treaty passed, and the new prime minister, Hayato Ikeda, made a brilliant move. He told the public, "Forget politics, let's get rich." He announced the income doubling plan. He promised refrigerators, cars, and TVs. The anger of the streets was bought off with the comfort of the living room. However, for this peace to work on the mainland, someone had to pay the price. That price was paid by Okinawa. While Tokyo rebuilt, Okinawa remained under US military occupation until 1972. Even today, this tiny island hosts 70% of US bases in Japan. The Japanese government also engaged in Mitsuyaku, secret agreements. Publicly, Japan had the 3 non-nuclear principles, no nukes. Privately, they allowed US nuclear ships to dock in their ports. It was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The public got to feel pacifist, the Americans got their strategic access, and the Okinawans got the noise and the crime. The friction of the occupation was geographically quarantined, far away from the politicians in Tokyo. Finally, there was the cultural seduction. You don't take revenge on the culture you want to emulate. Japan fell in love with American modernity, baseball, jazz, Hollywood. The enemy became the model. By the 1980s, Japan had achieved something the Imperial Navy never could. They bought Rockefeller Center. They bought Columbia Pictures. Sony and Toyota dominated the American home. They had achieved economic vengeance. They beat America at its own game, within the alliance. Why use a sword when you can use a yen? The absence of Japanese revenge is not a story of weakness. It is a story of supreme pragmatic strength. In 1945, Japan faced a choice: die with honor or live with shame. They chose to live. They swallowed the bitterness. They accepted the occupation. They utilized the Cold War. They realized that in the nuclear age, revenge is a suicide pact. Instead of looking back at the fire that destroyed them, they used the fire of their conqueror to forge a new steel. Japan didn't forgive. They just calculated that winning didn't mean destroying the enemy. It meant surviving them. And looking at Tokyo today, who can say they were wrong?